So today's daf is daf Yud Beis, and we'll start with the Mishnah on the second line down from the top, Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Now this Mishnah is going to quote another machlokas between Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, and Hilchos Yontif. And as an introduction, we have to know that with regard to Hotzah, on Shabbos, one of the malachos that listed on Daf Ayin Gimel, the famous Mishnah in Kal Gadol, is Hotzah. And that means you're not allowed to carry something from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah or vice versa. On Yontif, however, we have halacha of Litzorech Achila, because the Torah says in the Parsha of Yontif, and this is in Parshas Bo, and the Torah allows you to do malacha on Yontif for the sake of Ochel Nefesh. Beit Shammai omrim ein motziin lo sakatan lo salulav lo sefer Torah l'shus Rav. Beit Shammai said the Torah allows you for the sake of Ochel Nefesh to carry something, but to carry something that's not Ochel Nefesh, it may have a purpose during the day. Let's say you want to bring a child to shul, and you carry the child. If the child is not capable of walking on his own because he's a very young infant. A lulav, for example, you want to take the lulav and it's both Shabbos and Sukkos, or, for example, Sefer Torah. Just let me mute this. Okay, good. Or it's a Sefer Torah, and you're carrying a Sefer Torah for the sake of reading it. That's a very nice and noble effort on Yom Tov if you want to read from a Sefer Torah. But nevertheless, it's not L'tzorech Achila, and Beit Shammai hold that the Torah only allowed L'tzorech Achila. Okay then? So we're on Daf Yud Beis, and we'll finish the Mishnah on Daf Yud. Oh, yeah, we're learning Daf Yomi and Beitza. Beis Hillel Matirin, Beis Hillel hold that the Torah allowed you on Yontif to do not only a malacha for the specific purpose of Ochel Nefesh, but even if it's not L'tzorech Achila, as long as it's got a tzorech and it has a purpose on this day, I mean, we're not talking about carrying stones out for tomorrow's construction after Yontif, but we're talking about bringing the cotton to shul on Yontif, the lulav to shul, the Sefer Torah to shul. So you can fit this into the perspective of what's called the tzorech Yontif, the tzorech hayom, even though it's not the tzorech Achila, and that's mutter. The Gemara quotes a Bryce, Tani Tana Kami de Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. And the Chachamim who used to bring the Brysos in front of Rabbi Yitzchak. And here's the Lashon of the Bryce. Hashochet olas nidava b'yontif loke. The Bryce records the following opinion. A person on his own, when I say on his own, I mean voluntarily, obligated himself to bring a korban olah. Now, a korban olah, as you know, is kulo kolil. There's no achila whatsoever. So he wants to fulfill his personal pledge, his voluntary acceptance upon himself to bring in a dava, but he's not going to be able to eat anything from this korban because it's a korban olah. And therefore, when he does shchita, which is one of the 39 malachos, on Shabbos he'd be chayv kares and misa. On Yontif he gets malchus. And you cannot consider this litzorech ochel nefesh because, as we said before, in the case of a korban olah, there's no achila whatsoever. Amalei, so Rabbi Yitzchak, when he heard this brisa, he spoke to the Chachamim who brought this brisa to his attention, and he pointed out the Amalecha Mani. If you're going to ask me who is the author of that brisa, whose sheet is reflecting that brisa, the answer is Beit Shammai. It's only the sheet of Beit Shammai because Beit Shammai take a very narrow definition of the heter that the Torah allowed you to do malacha on Yontif L'tzorech Ochel Nefesh, and it's got to be literally L'tzorech Ochel Nefesh. If you're not going to eat any part of the korban adava because it's a korban olah, then it's not L'tzorech Ochel Nefesh. Therefore, you violate the Isa Lav of Kol Malach Lo Saseh. It's a Malach on Yontif, which generates Malchus. And what is the Shita Beit Shammai? Now Rabbi Yitzchak gives us a little bit of an insight into Beit Shammai. The Amri, they hold Lo Amri. We don't say the following, which is going to be the principle of Beis Hillel, but Beit Shammai rejected, namely, Mitoch Shehutra Hotza Litzorech, Hutra Nami Shelo Litzorech. And my friends, this is one of the most famous lines, if not the most famous line in the entire Masechet. It's called Mitoch, and I'm sure you've heard of it many times. But here's, it's nice to see the original location of that concept called Mitoch. And once again, Mitoch is now bracketed with a minus sign in front of that bracket because we're holding now like Beit Shammai. They never accepted the principle of Mitoch. What is the principle of Mitoch? The principle of Mitoch defines certain malachos that by very nature, they are usually done for Ochel Nefesh. And with regard to those malachos, which are so helpful for Ochel Nefesh, if you hold Mitoch, the Torah allows you to do those malachos even Shelo Litzorech Ochel Nefesh. Even when it's not specifically for the purpose of eating. Like, for example, shechita. Normally, we shecht an animal in order to eat its meat. That defines and classifies the malach of shechita as a malach Ochel Nefesh. Beit Shammai say, well, the Torah says, you're allowed to do shechita for the purpose of achila, but in the case, a rare case of a shechita that has no achila, namely in the case of a karban ola, then that's not included in Ochel Nefesh. Comes along Beit Shammai, the Beis Hillel, the Beis Hillel, Ha'amri, they maintain, Mitoch shehutra otzol litzorech, hutra nami shelo litzorech. The Chachamim had a Kabbalah. This is not in the Torah itself. You won't find it in Torah Shebetzav, it's Torah Shebal Peh. And the oral tradition that Beis Hillel accepted was that the Torah allows this malacha because it's by nature a meleches ochel nefesh, even if you're implementing the malacha shelo litzorech ochel nefesh. Now here, Abosa, I have to tell you, there's a fundamental machlokes between Rashi and other Rishonim how to understand mitoch. Rashi understands that mitoch tells me that this malacha on a doraisa level is muteres. It's completely allowed. It's permissible. And Tosfos, quoting a Gemara in Pesachim, which I'll mention in just a minute, proves that that's not so. Mitoch says that we can expand the definition of litzorech from the narrow definition of ochel nefesh to a broader definition called litzorech hayom, anything that has a purpose on that day. That's the extent of the scope of mitoch. And the machlokas between Rashi and Tosfos is very fundamental. For example, the Gemara Pesachim speaks about a case of ha'ofer, he's baking, mi yontif l'chol. On Yontif, he or she is baking without any intention whatsoever to eat the product of the baked goods on Yontif. So there's no Ochel Nefesh. And Rashi is going to say, well, we apply the principle of mitoch, that even though he's cooking for or baking for tomorrow, for the day after Yontif, but since cooking or baking, afia, bishul, are classic malachas Ochel Nefesh inherently, then the Torah allowed it even shelo litzorech nefesh, even if it's for the purpose of tomorrow. And Tosfos quotes the Gemara Pesachim. The Gemara Pesachim quotes of Chizda, who says ha'ofer mi yontif l'chol. He's baking on yontif for tomorrow. Loke gets malchus. Obviously, then litzorech can be expanded through mitoch to include shelo litzorech nefesh, but it's got to be litzorech hayom. If it's litzorech moch. If it's a tzorach chol, then it doesn't come under mitoch, and you violate an iser malacha doraisa. In other words, according to Tosfos' approach, even Beis Hillel who accept mitoch will not exclude any malacha on yontif simply because it's a malacha ochel nefesh. They also need a tzorach. They need what's called a matir, something to permit. It's got to be a tzorach. It doesn't have to be tzorach achila. Mitoch expands that to a tzorach hayom, but it has to be for the purpose of the day. And therefore, Tosfos says very well that the machlokes between Beis Hillel Beit Shammai in our Mishnah is a person who's carrying on yontif a katan, a lulav, or a sefer Torah for litzorach hayom. He needs it on the day of Yontif in order to fulfill his mitzvah, lulav, etc. Rashi, on the other hand, extends the principle of mitoch to completely remove the Isser Malach. And by the way, there's a Ramban in his commentary on the Torah that seems to agree with Rashi. There's also a Rambam that seems to agree with Rashi. So Rashi is not a loner. And the Achronim worked very hard to defend Rashi against a whole onslaught of kashas that the Rishonim raised against Rashi. In any event, just to finish up Rabbi Yitzchak's point, he says, Hachanami, here too, in the case of shchita of an olah, where you cannot eat anything from the shchita, mitoch shehutra shchita litzorech, hutra nami shelo litzorech. Beis Hillel would say that the Torah would permit you to slaughter this carbon olah on Yontif, and he's not chayiv malchus, and the reason for that is because of mitoch. Rashi will learn that even though he has no purpose on this particular day, nevertheless it's mutter because shchita is a meleches ochel nefesh. The other Rishonim, like Tosfos, are going to learn, no, it's the tzarech hayom, because since he commanded, he took upon himself a nidava, meaning a voluntary carbon, then until he brings his carbon, he's missing a certain, shall we call it, a spiritual pleasure that he gets from bringing the carbon on the mizbeach. And that makes it at least l'tzarech hayom. So just to summarize, we learned here from Rabbi Yitzchak is any brisa that tells you that if you shech the carbon olah on Yontif, you get malchus, that brisa must by definition reflect the shita of Beit Shammai. Maskif law, Rabbah attacks Rabbi Yitzchak. How do you know it's Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, b'ha pligi, that there's machlokas between Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai about mitov? Perhaps I could argue, Dilma, even Beis Hillel reject the principle of mitoch. That means that universally we don't have mitoch, and all we have is a heter of litzorech ochel nefesh. It's got to be for food, and therefore, in the framework of Rabbah's kasha, Beis Hillel could agree that at shochet nidava would get malchus because that shechita is not ochel nefesh. So then why would Beis Hillel allow the carrying of a katan, a lulav, and a sefer Torah? It's a different issue entirely. The erev hotzah l'Shabbos, v'ein erev hotzah l'Yontif kamifli. They're arguing about the following principle. And the Gemara formulates the principle as Beis Hillel accepted it. That although on Shabbos the Torah prohibited hotzah, and therefore, if a person wants to carry on Shabbos from his chatzer into his house, or from his house into his chatzer, he needs what's called an erev chatzeros, because otherwise it's similar to carrying from one rishus to the other, because a chatzer is almost like a rishus rabbin, or it's a bavui. And Beis Hillel maintained that the Torah never prohibited hotzah on Yontif, although there are 39 malachas on Shabbos. On Yontif, there are only 38 malachas. And the Rishonim want to know, why is it that hotzah, carrying, was dropped in the list of malachos that appear for Shabbos and did not appear on Yontif? Some Rishonim say that the reason why, according to Beis Hillel, hotzah was never prohibited on Yontif is because it's called a malacha grua. Are you familiar with that? Malacha grua, which literally means it's an inferior malacha. There's one difference fundamental between 38 and hotzah. All of the 38 malachas generate a change in the object. Hotzah doesn't change the object, it only changes its location. That makes it into a malacha grua. And on Yontif, Beis Hillel are of the opinion the Torah never prohibited a malacha grua. And in fact, when the Torah prohibits malach on Yontif, the Torah uses the term avoda, kol meleches avoda lotas. And hotzah is not considered meleches avoda. Other Rishonim say that the reason why Beis Hillel drops hotzah from the list of malachas asuras b'Yontif is for a different reason, and that's because hotzah is something that gives a man freedom on Yontif to carry food. He wants to visit a friend, a neighbor, and he's going to bring over some food. He's going to bring a bottle of wine, whatever he's going to bring. So the Torah never prohibited Hotzah on Yontif. Mar Sovar, according to Beit Shammai, Erev Hotzah l'Shabbos, the Erev Hotzah l'Yontif. To the same extent that the Torah prohibited Hotzah as one of the 39 malachas, and the Rabbanu were Masakin Erev Chatzeros. With regard to Shabbos, the same applies to Yontif. And even on Yontif, there are 39 malachas, one of which is Hotzah. And any malach that you do with tzarech ochel nefesh is mutter. But in the case of katan, lulav, and sefer Torah, there's no ochel nefesh. Mar Sava, but Beis Hillel hold erev hotzah l'Shabbos, the ain erev hotzah l'Yontif. The Torah never prohibited hotzah on Yontif, and therefore, if you're carrying from Rishus Hayoch, Rishus Harabim, a katan or a sefer Torah lulav, then you don't violate any Yisur. And now Beis Hillel quotes what's called an asmachta. An asmachta means he finds a little bit of a peg to hang his hat on to try to prove, so to speak. It's not a real proof, but nevertheless, it's an asmachta to demonstrate that there's no Iser Hotzah on Yontif. It says in Sefer Yirmiyah, the lo sotziu masa mibatechem, and the next two words, the Yom HaShabbos. When Yirmiyah was warning the people of Israel not to carry from their homes into Rosh Hashanah, he adds two words, the Yom HaShabbos. Why specify Shabbos if it applies to Yontif as well? The implication, therefore, is the Shabbos on Shabbos you have to be very careful not to violate Melechas Hotzah Mershus L'Shus. The Yontif lo, but on Yontif there's no Iser Hotzah, says Rabbah, therefore. The machlokas Shri Beis Hillel Beit Shammai is very specific to Meleches Hotzah. Beis Hillel will allow you to carry on Yontif, any kind of carrying on Yontif. And certainly for the noble purpose of Sefer Torah and Katan and Lulav. But even without that, even if it was, let's say you would be carrying stones, which have no purpose on Yontif whatsoever, that also would be okay. You can carry stones from Rishus HaYochid out to Rishus HaRabban. And the reason for that is because there's no malach of hotzah on Yontif, according to this interpretation of Beis Hillel. So any hotzah would be mutter. It doesn't have to be a hotzah for the purpose of katan and lulav and sefer Torah. Any hotzah would be mutter. The Torah did not prohibit the malach of hotzah on Yontif, according to this. That's Rabbah's presentation of Beis Hillel. However, in the case of Shechita, Beis Hillel agreed to Beit Shammai that the only Shechita that could be allowed on Yontif would be Litzorech Ochel Nefesh. If as a result of the Shechita, you're going to eat the flesh. And now the Gemara is going to reject Rabbah and go back to the original interpretation of Rabbi Yitzchak that the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai revolves around Mitot and applies to many, many malachos, not just Otzah. Maskif la Rav Yosef Elameata. If they're only arguing Beis Hillel Beit Shammai that these are Hotzah b'Yontif, is liflagu be'avanim. Why did the Mishnah record the machlokes between Beis Hillel Beit Shammai by carrying a child, etc.? Why not a case of carrying avanim? Avanim themselves have no purpose whatsoever on Yontif. It's great that he wants to take stones out of his private domain. Maybe it's clogging up his private property, his courtyard, etc., his backyard. But there's no element whatsoever of ochel nefesh. So why confuse me and formulate the heter of Beis Hillel against Beit Shammai in the cases of katan and lulav and sefer Torah? Why not go a step further and tell me that you're allowed to carry avanim, you're allowed to carry stones? Now the Rishonim asked the following question: what do you mean you're allowed to carry stones? What happened to muktzah? You know that there's a machlokas how far the scope of muktzah extends, but everybody agrees that avanim, that stones are certainly muktzah. That's called muktzah machmas gufa. It has no purpose, and therefore it's muktzah. So Tosfos points out over here that the Iser muktzah was a Xeras Chachamim. The Chachamim enacted a rabbinic prohibition of muktzah in order to avoid hotzah. And they were afraid that if you carry certain objects, even within your own private domain, you might come to carry them outside your private domain, out into the Rishus Harabah, and violate the Meleches Hotzah Doraisa. although you may ask me, there was never an Isur Muktzah with regard to Oklim, foodstuffs are not Muktzah Kalim, vessels are not Muktzah. Why not be afraid that if you're allowed to carry vessels, he might carry them out into Rosh Hashanah? The answer is, we have a principle called Gzeira She'ein Hatzibur Yechola Lamodo. There are certain Gzeiros that are so far and so extensive, they're so overarching that the people could not live up to that Gzeira. They couldn't, they could not subjugate themselves to that tremendous Isa, like the Gemara at the end of Avodah Zarah, for example, says that Shemen Akub. Does anybody have any problem going into, what's your favorite chain store in Chutz La'aretz? I'm a little out of it. I haven't been in Chutz La'aretz for a while. In the Lower East Side, there's something called Fanfare, or used to be A&P. Are they still in business? Long time. That's long. They're out. ShopRite. Okay, ShopRite. Down in Florida, what's it called? It's a very big chain all over Florida. So I go to ShopRite. Does anybody have any problem buying oil? And there was a Gzeira at the end of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that we don't buy oil from Goyim. Like we don't take their wines and we don't take their milk, we don't take their oil. But the Gemara says that there was a Gzeira Sheinat Sibur Yichol Lama. They couldn't live up to that standard. So they permitted buying oil from Goyim. Here also, if you're going to tell me I can't carry Oakland, even in my private backyard, I can't carry Caleb, it's impossible. Shabbos would be miserable. So that was Gzeira. But books of things that have no purpose on Shabbos, that was accepted, but only as a Geder, as a Gzeira, because of Hotzah. However, according to Beis Hillel, in the framework of Rabbah, there is no malach of Hotzah and Yontif. So therefore, ipso facto, there could be no Gzeira of Muktzah. Therefore, I could be Metaltel Avonim. I could even carry stones. And that wouldn't be a problem at all. According to Rashi's understanding, you could carry stones from one rishus to the other on Yontif. If the Mishnah didn't give us that more far-reaching, radical chiddush that there's a machlokas even as far as avonim is concerned, apparently there is no machlokas as far as avonim is concerned. That the machlokas here is not about avonim. Avonim would be prohibited because of the malach of hotzah, and they still agree there is a malach of hotzah. Just that the malach of hotzah is generally lochel nefesh, but we can expand it according to Beis Hillel to include even shalol tzorach nefesh. But it has to be a tzorach. There has to be some purpose on yontif for my hotzah. If, on the other hand, I'm carrying avonim, which has no purpose whatsoever on yontif, then I violate the malach of hotzah. The Af Rabbi Yochanan Savar, we're going to now prove that it's not just Rabbi Yitzchak who came up in interpreting Beis Hillel with the principle of mitoch, but even Rabbi Yochanan accepted mitoch. Meaning, Beit Shammai never accepted the principle of mitoch, hence carrying for the purpose of a katan or a lulav or a sefer Torah is prohibited, whereas Beis Hillel accepted the principle of mitoch, and even though it's not for the purpose of achila, but it has some purpose on this day, that's enough to allow you that hotzah. There was a brisa that was quoted in the presence of Rabbi Yochanan, and we'll see that Rabbi Yochanan is going to reject this brisa. It cannot be. Amavashel. Now, just by way of introduction, very often the Gemara, and we're looking at a very typical methodology in the Talmud, the Gemara will show you how with one action and then its aftermath, you can violate multiple isurim and you get multiple malchios, multiple punishments. Samavashel gira noshen. Now, at this point, we have one problem off the top of the list, and that's going to be bishul on yontif. Now, bishul on yontif is okay for ochel nefesh, but you can't eat a gid anosh. The Torah prohibited gid anosh. And not only that, he cooked the gid anosha together with cholov. Now, this Gemara is assuming what's called yesh begidim b'not seitam, that the gid anosha, which some identify as the sciatic nerve, I don't know. In any way, it's some sort of a sinew in the body. It's in the thigh of the animal, and the Torah prohibited it, but it's basar. It has the status of basar. It has a taste to it, a taste of basar. Now, if you cook basar b'cholov together, you get malchus. The Torah says 3 times, over and over again. The Torah repeats itself. Lo savachel gedi b'chalev imo. And the Gemara says that chulin gedi is indicative of all basar. It's got to be kosher meat, but all meat is included under gedi. And when you cook meat and milk, in this case, gid anosha b'cholav, you get malchus for bishul gid anosha. So we already have 2 lavim that he found. And then in the aftermath of cooking the gid anosha together with cholav, the acholav, and he ate it. Now he's guilty of eating gid anosha. He's guilty of eating basar b'cholav. So he's already violated 4 different malchus. We'll see about the 5th in a second. Loka chamesh, he gets 5 sets of malchus. Number 1, loka mishum mevashel gid on yontif, because again, it's not litzorach ochel nefesh. Again, even though in his mind he's anticipating to eat the gid anosh, but that's now how the halacha operates. The halacha is not recognizing his anticipation to eat the gid anosh, because the Torah prohibited eating gid anosh. So this is shalol litzorach ochel nefesh. Halacha will not recognize litzorach ochel nefesh if that ochel nefesh is prohibited. So number 1, he gets malchus for bishul. Number 2, loka mishum ochel gid anosha, he ate the gid anosha. Loka mishum avashel basar v'cholav, loka mishum ochel basar v'cholav. And now we get to number 5. What is the 5th violation? And here we turn to Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, mishum havara. Before he put the gid anosha with the cholav in a pot over the fire, he lit the fire. And he lit the fire in a havara, burning of fire, shalol litzorach ochel nefesh, which is prohibited under the malach of havara. Havara and bishul are 2 separate malachos that generate 2 separate sets of malchus.